Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support and viewership on our recent content. And before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we're going to kick things off with the discussion about a trade, right, that occurred. Now, if you're watching this on Monday, on Sunday, around 11, 12, noonish Eastern time, you had a trade between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Brooklyn Nets. So the Los Angeles Lakers are trading D'Angelo Russell, Maxwell Lewis, 3 second-round picks, including 2027, 2030, and 2031. The Lakers own seconds. And in exchange for Dorian Finney-Smith and Shake Milton of the Brooklyn Nets. So this is a trade where it's kind of funny because in our last episode, right around the end of it, we were discussing a Mark Stein report that that talked about the idea that the Memphis Grizzlies seemingly were the front runners to get Dorian Finney-Smith. The idea was they were going to trade a protected first, heavily protected first, for, and I guess Luke Kennard and John Conchar in exchange for Dorian Finney-Smith. But the Lakers apparently beat out that deal with the 3 second-round picks. I guess they didn't like the protection of it. But, for both teams, I would say this is a solid trade. I mean, I guess I was a little kind of surprised that, a team was going to actually give up a first for Dorian Finney-Smith, and it has nothing to do, with his quality as a player or anything like that. It's just, I didn't expect a team to do it. I thought it would probably be in the realm of seconds. But when you look at the swap, right, so Dorian Finney-Smith, 10 points a game, just under 5 rebounds, 46 from the field. Career high so far, nearly 44% from 3, right? Essentially kind of, a 3-and-D wing, right? So he's playing for Brooklyn. He started in the 20 games he's played for the Brooklyn Nets. He's kind of been in and out of the lineup, due to, whatever, injuries, trade rumors, whatever. But for the Lakers, you get a solid 3-and-D wing. Again, not like a perfect player, by any means, but a guy that fits the role of what you want the Lakers to do, right? Because we've talked about it where in terms of their checklist, right, they primarily needed 3 things, right? They needed mostly two-way guys, right? But in terms of player archetypes, some type of athleticism in the backcourt, some type of two-way presence at the wing spot, and some type of help in terms of a big man. And they got one of those things, right? They got a guy in Dorian Finney-Smith who could either start or come off the bench. I'm curious to see how that lineup rotation goes. But, it gives you more of those type of guys that you would like to have in a playoff series because they don't have a lot of depth, right? Like, even though they've had a number of guys out due to injury, a lot of the guys that are playing minutes are not like amazing. Like, say, like Cam Reddish, because Vanderbilt's out, Cam Reddish is playing. And he's been fine off the bench. But, like, in a playoff series, you probably would rather have Dorian Finney-Smith in that spot than, say, like a Cam Reddish, right? If you're going to rely on him for, 20-something minutes a game, however many minutes he'll play. So D'Angelo Russell, he obviously goes back to Brooklyn, right? That's where he was when the Lakers traded him the first time to the Brooklyn Nets, right? So presumably he'll either be the starting point guard or, whatever there. I'm curious to see what happens because some reports have suggested he could be a buyout guy. He makes $18 million. So, that would mean that if, there are some teams that he can't really join. So I would think he would probably just be there, but I could be wrong. We'll see. But for the Nets, we've talked about it before where they needed to kind of start selling off guys and kind of just get back whatever they can, right? Regardless of whether or not it's second round picks, protected firsts or whatever, right? Because a lot of the guys that they're trying to trade, not all of them, but some of them, you just weren't getting multiple first for. You might be able to for Cam Johnson, possibly, but not for these other guys. And, they got 3 firsts or 3 seconds for Dennis Schroeder, I guess 2 in net. And then they got 3 seconds for Dorian Finney-Smith. And I guess, Shake Milton is also in the deal as well, right? As a kind of a potential throw-in guy who could be like, a decent backup scoring guard off the bench. You never know with that. But it's a trade that makes sense for both sides, both teams, just because from the Lakers, right, you're sending out a guy that you probably weren't bringing back and as of late hasn't played as significant of a role for the team, right? Like Austin Reeves has now kind of moved to the role of the starting point guard, so D'Lo's playing off the bench, backup minutes and things like that. And then they've also kind of, per Anthony Irwin, right? He has of clutch points, right? He's had it. His source basically says that with the play of Austin Reeves, Max Christie's been starting as the other defensive-minded guard, and then I guess with the play of Gabe Vincent off the bench, like you just don't really need D'Lo as much anymore. He's an expiring contract, and really, if you're not going to keep him, you have to move him because otherwise he'll walk. You won't really be able to replace him, in terms of cap space. So you basically lose an asset for nothing, right? So Dorian Finney-Smith has a player option, right? $15 million this year, $15 million basically the next season, right? So presumably he'll opt into that. So if you're the Lakers, you got a solid role player for just seconds. They didn't have to give up any firsts. Obviously, you gave up D'Angelo Russell, so that was your biggest expiring contract. So presumably, whatever other moves there may not be as many like big moves in terms of what they do. We'll see because they can still do stuff. It's just it would involve other players, obviously, as opposed to D'Angelo Russell. Can't really aggregate him in the trade now with other players because he's gone. But it's good, right? Because again, you need those type of guys on that Laker team because especially with Vanderbilt not being healthy at all in the last couple of seasons, you needed help on the wing, right? Because there's just a lot of games where there's just not enough size and not enough defensive aptitude out there. And it's a guy that kind of has a reputation for being kind of like a feisty, competitive guy, which is again another type of player that the Lakers need. And then again, for the Nets perspective, you get your old point guard buddy back, I guess. Maybe you re-sign him, maybe you don't. But the main thing is you get the second round picks for a guy that really didn't have a future on your team. So good deal for both sides. Obviously, for the Lakers, if you want to continue to move up, tiers, there's still more work that needs to be done. But, at the same time, it's solid. And then for the Nets, hey, try out Maxwell Lewis, see what he can do. If he doesn't do anything, then you didn't really lose out on anything, right? Because he's a second round pick that doesn't make a whole lot of money. And, if he pans out, okay, that's cool. But, the Lakers, they still have other contracts they can move. You could move JHS. You can move Gabe Vincent. If you wanted to, I guess you could move, like a Rui or Vando, or whomever, right? So they have other guys they can move. It's just D'Lo is the biggest expiring contract. So that's kind of the main thing here, right? And again, that relationship seemingly had run its course, right? Like now that he's a backup point guard, you just didn't really need him as much anymore. He had been a plus minus guy for them, but you just didn't really need his skill set as much. And you might be able to get that maybe by swapping somebody else. And that might be a guy that maybe might in the playoffs be a little bit more reliable than D'Angelo Russell, even though up to this season, he had been a pretty impactful regular season guy for them, in terms of the counting stats. I know plus minus wise, it's been pretty continuously positive in the regular season, but it felt like it was kind of probably time to move on. And we knew this was coming anyways. It just came a year later than I think we were expecting, because I think we were expecting something like this to be done last season, but he wasn't an expiring last season, and that may have been what might have been tougher to move those type of contracts, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to kind of grade it as a win-win. I think both teams got, something that they wanted, at least, in terms of that. Like you said, the Lakers get a 3-and-D guy, 3-and-D wing specifically, and I think that's something that they've been lacking in. And we already knew that was something that they definitely needed. And alongside that big man, which I think will potentially come later down the line, but it's good that they're being aggressive, but earlier than you probably would have thought. I didn't think they were going to be this aggressive this early. I thought D'Lo was going to get traded around the deadline, not this early. So that's a good sign, I think. And I think most Laker fans, like at least from what I've seen, they're pretty hyped about, getting D'Lo off the team because, like you said, it had definitely run its course. Once I think you saw that he was going to the bench, you knew that he was out of there. You just didn't really know when or where he was going to go. But I like the fit for Brooklyn. Maybe he can be somewhat of a mentor to some of those guys over there, that, are a little bit more offensive minded. I don't know. It's an expiring deal, so I don't expect, too much to come out of it, but, still it's a win-win for both sides for sure. And, hey, I hope he balls out, again, because it's like history is freaking repeating itself, This isn't his first time in Brooklyn.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, and that's kind of the interesting, thing here where we, for over a year, we were kind of wondering, like, what are they going to move him for, right? Are they
Mhm.
going to move him for, another point guard, right? Like, or like say DeJounte Murray a year ago, where they're going to move him for, some type of, where they're going to aggregate him together in some type of package for a star, right? And so that's kind of where you look at it now, right? Where again, it's a position of need, right? That should help this team out in the playoffs a little bit more. Even if, because say like if you're a 3-and-D guy, like obviously you got to knock down shots, but you can bring things to the table even if the shot isn't falling. And I think that was kind of the problem that we talked about with so many of the players on their roster is that there's a bunch of there's a bunch of guys that are primarily one-dimensional players, but most of them lean towards offense, right?
Yeah.
And like Vanderbilt is a one-dimensional guy, but he's on the line of defense, but
Hmm.
he hasn't played, right? So Rui, right? That's kind of been the forward that's replaced Vanderbilt in the starting five, right? He's more offense, right? Doesn't really give you as much defensively. So I guess one question that I'm kind of curious of is, do you think that they end up starting Dorian Finney-Smith? Maybe not necessarily right now, just because they're in a groove. They've been playing much better as of late. They've kind of found a lineup that seems to work. Or is it still stick with Rui as the starter, but maybe like close games with, Dorian Finney-Smith? Because, when they traded for Vanderbilt and Rui, right, Vanderbilt became the starter, but then a lot of times they would close games with Rui if he was, if his shot was falling, which in the playoffs it definitely was.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good question because I think, it's probably going to depend on a night to night basis. But who knows? Because I think you really like what Rory's been able to do, this season. I think, specifically, I think, his numbers haven't looked too bad, and I think offensively he looks pretty engaged. I think it's the defense, like you said, where you kind of still have question marks about what he's able to do. But, I think Finney Smith could be a little bit more versatile, I think, in that offense potentially, with his 3-and-D capabilities. So I don't think he'll start right away, but I could definitely see later down the line they definitely insert him. I think it would make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and this is kind of like what we talked about, where they just needed to shore up the depth of the roster and
Yeah.
get, some more, just professional two-way guys on it, right?
Yeah.
Because say like a guy like a Maxwell Lewis, he was never going to play. He's not really NBA ready yet. And a
Mhm.
Shake Milton, maybe he's not great, but he's certainly, more capable of, NBA level production than,
Better than
like
Gabe Vincent
sure, but like
offensively.
and like Gabe Vincent, funny enough, has actually been playing better as of late. We'll see if he keeps it up. We'll see if he's ending up. We'll see if he ends up in a deal. But just in general, that's kind of the stuff. If you're not going after a star, which has been what's kind of been reported, then these type of moves are the moves you need to make. And
Yeah.
again, this is pretty cool. This is pretty ideal because you got a rotational player and didn't really have to give up much. I mean, obviously you had to give up D'Angelo Russell, but like we talked about, that was running its course, and it was, we knew that at a certain point he was going to get moved. It's just a matter of can they do more, and like they can. It's just kind of funny, right? Because there was reporting the day before, right, that the most likely scenario was that they wouldn't do much until February, which is what we usually see.
Hmm.
Then, like, fast forward a day later, if that, right, then obviously, things can change, right? So just, obviously, as I guess, the main question is what is the next move for them,
Mm.
right? Because we've talked about the types of players that they need. So again, it's like what we talked about with Golden State, where it's a good start. You just have to do more. But, if you're Palenka, right, these are the type of moves that you need to explore. You got to be aggressive, and you need to find ways to get these type of players onto the roster, right? Because, regardless, you're not going to be favored, but if you have LeBron and AD and a decent supporting cast, especially if you have multiple guys that can play on both ends of the floor, you have worst case scenario have a puncher's chance, and that's really, you know, the least you could ask, in terms of can you at least put together a roster that can compete in the postseason? Because in theory, right, like if you're not going to do much, then they don't really need to be here, right? Like if they say if they ended up going into the deadline and not having done anything, then you might as well just prepare to kind of trade those guys in the offseason, right?
Hmm.
Just prepare, for whatever. But obviously, this is a good start. So we'll see what Palinka does, right? Because this is the first deal that they've made since the trade of Russell Westbrook going to Utah, right? When they traded him away and brought in those other guys. So,
Hmm.
again, we'll see where things go from here, but it's a good start, right? Like, because, after the four teams, the top four seeds, right? Five and after that is kind of in flux. So if you're the Lakers doing a deal like this now, right, should help you in theory compared to some of these other teams who also need help but haven't done anything as of yet.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so now we're gonna go into we're getting close to New Year's, right? You're watching this presumably on December 30th, so you'll be a couple days away from, 2025. So I thought we would kind of get into, some New Year's resolutions for a lot, for these NBA teams. Some of these, like, we don't have to talk about as much in terms of, like, we're mainly grouping them together into a handful of different tiers. So we'll, I guess we'll start at the bottom and kind of start with, the bottom feeder teams in the NBA, right? So like New Orleans, Utah, the Blazers, the Wizards, right? Basically sell, 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 right? Like all of those teams have players that I think, worst case scenario, playoff teams, maybe not even just championship teams, but like playoff teams would want on their roster because they're
Yeah.
better than some of the guys that maybe are on the back end of the roster. So if you're a team like the Blazers, can you move a guy like, Robert Williams, right? Could you move a guy like, I don't think he'll get moved, but say like a Jeremy Grant? Could you move like a Matisse Thybulle, right?
Hmm.
For Utah, right? Jordan Clarkson, maybe Sexton, right? Maybe some of these other guys like Kessler or Collins or whomever, right? For New Orleans, right? Almost everybody seemingly might be up for sale there. So
Hmm.
obviously, a ton of their players. And then for the Wizards, right? Guys like Valanciunas, right? Guys like Brogdon, and guys like that. And I guess teams like the Hornets and Raptors also have bad records too, so you can kind of put them in there. I don't think the Hornets will be looking to sell just because like their main issues they've had so many ridiculous injuries.
Yep.
The Raptors are kind of in a similar boat where it feels like their core five are probably kind of intact for now. The Nets also are another team where you continue to sell, so you can add them into the mix as well. Obviously, they just made the Dorian Finney-Smith trade, but I'm sure for them they'll presumably be more on the way. But those, that grouping of those 8 teams, that's their New Year's resolutions, right? Basically, sell, 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 and see and try to get whatever you can back, even if it's like just seconds, right? Like it's better than keeping some of those guys on your roster, right? Like if you're the Nets, getting back 3 seconds and Maxwell Lewis and D'Angelo Russell, that's better than just being like, well, we're not getting, an unprotected first or multiple firsts for him, so we're just gonna keep him.
Right. I get that 100%. And I think I would add to that, I agree 100%. And I would add to that in continue to be bad. Don't try and, win games either. I think, and I think that goes from the majority of the teams. Like you said, like Charlotte, it was a little bit of a different story. But if you're, Utah, New Orleans, Washington, I think you should be aiming for as high of a draft pick as you possibly can if you own your own pick. So that's what I would kind of add on to there as well.
Yeah, sell, 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 lose, lose, lose. Right? Like that's essentially, I guess, what you want. Like, say,
Yes.
like a team like the Wizards, right, where like they have a competitive game against the Knicks. So you almost kind of get the best of both worlds, where it's like guys are playing well, and kind of playing together
Yep.
and trying to figure stuff out, but then you still come out of the game with a loss. Like that's what you want if you're
Yeah.
the Washington Wizards, right?
And you're
Because you
rehabbing
don't
some
want to
guys'
lose.
value too. Like there's some guys who have been playing arguably better, but then there's also other guys, and that goes for all these teams, that there's
Yeah,
veteran guys that are good that could be even better, I think, on a playoff or a contending team, but they're
hmm
also taking away from the younger players' development on,
right.
said team that they're on right now. So,
Yeah,
it's a double-edged sword, but we already
yeah.
know how that
Same
goes.
Yeah, same with like the Utah Jazz, right? A
Yeah.
competitive game against the Philadelphia 76ers,
Hmm.
right? And then they lose right at the end. Like that's what you want, essentially.
Yes.
Like you don't want every game to be a blowout just because, I think that kind of builds a little bit more negative habits for a lot of
Agreed.
the young guys on the roster. I think you at the very least want to look like a competitive roster, even
Agreed.
if your record is absolutely atrocious,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Yes.
then you kind of go into, this next tier, which, I guess is a little bit more jumbled up. But say like teams like teams like Detroit, I guess teams like the Spurs, right? I those are the kind of teams where I think you're kind of looking to, you know, maybe buy, but not necessarily give up a ton. Like say if you're the Spurs, right? Like obviously they've been active, like not that they're going to get him, right? But they've been rumored in as being interested in De'Aaron Fox, right? Like you're continuing to see what you have with this roster, right? Where both teams have added veterans to kind of also, pair with their young cores. And you're seeing what you got. And then, maybe at the deadline, could you buy in on a guy? It doesn't have to be necessarily a big time star, but like, could you possibly, buy in on a guy, and kind of take some of those guys and turn them into better players? And then maybe could you move up, from play in to playoff? I mean, like, obviously both of those teams, they're in the play in mix, right? Like, if you're the Spurs, you're 9 right now. Not saying that they're going to make the playoffs, but, they're, they're on track in terms of the developmental curve, I guess, for that team. For the Detroit Pistons, right? Like, they won 14 games all of last year. They've already won 14 games, through the first 32 games for this, for them on the season. So I
Hmm.
think, for teams like that, that's kind of what you're looking for, right? A team like the Bulls, it's a little bit different because they're almost kind of, you feel like maybe in that sell category too, but maybe only from the perspective of like not the entire roster, just
Sure.
like a handful of guys, like say like a Vucevic or maybe a Zach Levine, depending on what offers you get back. We don't know
Lonzo.
if they're gonna get. Yeah, Lonzo too. So they're in like a little bit different of a group from some of the other sell ones because they're
Yeah.
not quite as bad.
Yeah.
But like they don't really need to be in this mix of we're 9 and 10 competing for a play-in spot. So you can kind of put them below Detroit and San Antonio, but maybe above a couple of these other teams because I don't think they're quite as bad as some of the other teams.
Yeah, I agree. It's a weird tier because, you kind of mentioned, teams that are in a similar spot, like you said, Detroit and San Antonio. But then there are some like weird outliers who aren't even in remotely the same spot as a franchise. But for San Antonio and Detroit, I think you should 100% continue to monitor, your superstar's talent because I think what Wemby's been able to do throughout the entire season thus far has been awesome, and then Cade as well. I think Cade has been one of the more underrated superstars in the league, young superstars. I know he doesn't get a lot of shine. We don't really talk about Detroit, but yeah, very underrated. So I think continue to monitor those guys, and think with the future in mind. That's what I would say to those teams as well. Don't just think about the here and now. Um, you know, Kind of when you're making moves, think about things down the line, not so much, the here and now. So, and then with
Mhm.
with Chicago, just continue to sell, I guess, potentially get guys off the team that probably don't need to be there, that end of an era kind of thing. I think they need to kind of move on.
Yeah, and like for Cade, it's a great story for him, right? Because this is a guy that there were many people who weren't quite sure about could he be a franchise guy. And
Yeah.
obviously like they're still a quote unquote below 500 team, but they look like a much better team and a big part of that is not just the role players they've acquired, but also the fact that he's a legit guy
Yeah, he's been balling.
that can win you, that can win you games, right? Like I mean, the Pistons um they've been a 500 team in the last 10 games,
Hmm.
right? But they had a stretch where they were, they beat what the Suns, they beat the Lakers, and they beat the Kings, right?
Yep.
And obviously we'll get into some of those teams soon as well. But just in general, props to them. Just
Yeah,
kind
for
of a
sure.
quick note
Yeah.
on them. Then you have this next tier, right? So this is more so in the East, right? The Pacers, the Heat and the Hawks. And I guess, Philly is kind of in a different tier because their record, is they're not as bad as their record says. It's because of the injuries they've
Yep.
had. But they're kind of in an interesting tier where like the Pacers, they've actually been better in the last 10 games, and a big part of that was during their 5-game win streak, right? Tyrese Halliburton was playing significantly better, like basically giving you 20 and 10, similar to what he was doing, at different points last season, right? After like a really rough start to the season. But now they've had like a couple of bad losses, including like a 40-point beatdown against the Boston Celtics. But I do kind of wonder what their approach as of late is, because just like in general, with the way Halliburton's playing, I think you feel better about this Pacers team compared to what you were thinking about him like maybe a few weeks ago, right? Where you're just kind of wondering like, hey, do we maybe have to move off of some guys? Obviously, they're not like an elite team, and they've definitely been, a more of a disappointment this year. But just the fact that Halliburton has now shown signs of life, right, and at least some hope that like he can kind of get back to what he was doing before, right? That's kind of your New Year's resolution is like continued, sustained success for Halliburton. And for the Heat, you need a Jimmy Butler solution, right? Whether or not you're going to decide whether or not you're keeping him or trading him. Pat Riley said, that they're not going to trade him. It doesn't mean that they won't. But just in general, some type of finality to that situation, I think, is what
Hmm.
you want there. Sixers obviously continued health because that's been the thing that's held them back the entire season. And then for the Hawks, continued progression from guys like Jalen Johnson, guys like Risa Shea, Dyson Daniels, right? Because they've seemingly found a core of guys around Trae Young that works. They're still 17 and 15, but this was a team that by and large most people kind of expected to be bad going into the season, us included, right? So we have to take the L on that one.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
they've kind of been in a tier where they're one of those teams where they're not going to win the Eastern Conference. They may not necessarily even win a playoff series, but they could be one of those sleeper scary teams that one of these higher seeds could possibly they could possibly upset one of these higher seeds, right? Like, I'm not saying they will beat the Knicks, or Orlando or Milwaukee. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying like they could provide more of a scare than maybe some of these other teams that are below them.
Agreed. Yeah, it's a weird tier. I think this is one of the harder ones to kind of like pinpoint. Like, I think the obvious answers are, we already talked about them. Like you said, Jimmy Butler. You kind of want to have some closure to that situation, and then Halliburton and the Indiana Pacers. You kind of want that to continue. So I would say, continue to hope for talent and progression from Indiana. 76ers, I guess, kind of goes back to the injury thing that you were talking about. And then with Miami, like I said, closure for that situation.
Yeah.
And then with the Hawks, I think this is an interesting one. I would kind of go further and raise expectations. That's what I would tell them to do, is raise the bar. Achieve and kind of overachieve. That's what I would say. You like you said, you clearly have a team that works with Trae Young, which we haven't seen in a couple of seasons. So now that you're kind of somewhat back to form, don't take that for granted, and continue to build on that. And hopefully, we do get to see them in the playoffs.
Yeah. And you can throw the Magic, I guess, into that tier as well. Like, they need to get healthy, obviously,
Yeah.
because they haven't had Franz or Paolo,
Yeah.
obviously, in a little while. And, they're 4-6 in their last 10. Actually, they just picked up a win
Yeah.
right against the Brooklyn Nets, right at the buzzer. But, and they've had like a few, like, where did that come from type of wins, right? Where it was like, they had, and like half of these were like games where they were down by a decent amount, right? Like, they were down by 20 something points to the Heat, came back and stole the win. They were down, I think, 15 against the Nets, stole the win. They stole a win against the Boston Celtics. So, but by and large, they're also kind of they're not, they're in like a similar tier as Philly is in like, can you get healthy, right? Like, I'm not expecting the Magic to represent the Eastern Conference. It's just their two best players are out. And they're still, we still don't really have a Paolo update, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-mm.
So, and we're almost in January. So, essentially we're kind of just, waiting to see what's going to happen there. But now we're kind of into this next tier, which kind of combines, once again, some of these teams from like both the East and West. And that's kind of like these teams where, you know, teams where, this is more so, I guess, in the West a little bit more, right? Teams that are good, but need more, and they should be buyers, right? Like, and I guess you could throw, teams like the Bucks and the Knicks in there as well, right? Because, I think the Knicks and the Bucks, they've played into contender status, but they're not necessarily expected to be, the favorites in their conference, right? It's still Boston, but we know that they could possibly make moves to make their team better. So you can add them in there, obviously, with the Bucks, right? We know, again, can they get some more defensive minded guys, to pair with Giannis and Dame, continue to also hoist up that 3-point shooting, maybe get some more athletes in there, right? For the Knicks, just some more bench depth because they have one of the worst benches in the NBA. You do have some guys off the bench like McBride, Cameron Payne. Now Precious Achua comes off the bench. You're hoping Mitchell Robinson comes back. We'll see what Landry Shamet can do. Can he be a rotational guy? But just in general, can you get, some stronger bench depth there? And then if you move out into the West, I mean, you could pretty much group everyone from like 5 to 11 in the Western Conference, where all of those teams are solid teams, but they're not quite good enough to win the title. They all need to make moves, right? So we can go like Lakers, Clippers, Nuggets, Wolves. Spurs are in a little bit different mix because I don't think they're
Yeah.
quite there
Warriors.
yet. Warriors and Suns. The Kings are in a very different tier that we'll probably get into last.
Yeah. Yeah.
But just in general, all those teams, I think, and you could toss Houston. Their record is better, but you could put Houston in there possibly too. They're in a different timeline, I think, so maybe you don't want to do that. But I think the 5 to 11 tier in the West, that's where like, can you make moves? Can you make some noise? And because the Lakers just made a move, obviously the Warriors got Dennis Schroeder. Nuggets haven't done anything yet. Minnesota hasn't done anything yet. I think for Minnesota, they're just kind of hoping that some of these role guys play better, right? Like they're 6-4 in the last. They just won 2 in a row. A crazy comeback win against the Houston Rockets that doesn't even feel real, but it is.
Yeah.
But all those teams, I think, you're kind of looking at you need to do more. Like say for the Warriors, they got a big win against the Phoenix Suns, but and Jonathan Kuminga's been better in the last couple of games, but the group is not good enough, to win the title, right? They're kind of in an interesting tier where I'm curious to see if they make any significant moves because there's been talks about them looking to acquire a star, but I don't necessarily know if the ownership is actually going to, do it. I don't necessarily know if they're going to do it, just considering the situation that they're in, with what they got going on. I don't know if they will. They might, but and then like with the Nuggets, you got Jokic, right, who's considered, the best player in the NBA or second best at worst. But the roster isn't quite good enough. They have been better in their last 10, but we know they still need more. Maybe part of that's Jamal Murray, so that could be like a little mini resolution for them. Just like I mentioned with Minnesota, can you get some of these other guys to play better? But for teams like the Warriors and the Suns, you need moves as well. It's not just about guys being better. You need to make moves. The Clippers, presumably you're getting Kawhi back, right? Reportedly, he's coming back January 4th. So that's a guy, right, obviously, that when he plays and he's healthy, he's a superstar. It's just a matter of how much can he actually play. And the Clippers have held their own, and they've been able to, hang around, right, even without Kawhi, right? Like they're 18-13. They haven't necessarily had the easiest schedule in the NBA. So, that's great for them that they're kind of right in the thick of it, even without Kawhi. And so that, so I think that's kind of the next tier for me.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's like you said, it's a bunch of Western Conference teams, but I think you do have to throw Milwaukee and New York in there, like you talked about. With Milwaukee, I would continue to kind of build up on defense, if possible, get more wings and really defensive minded guards, in my opinion, that could really help out, Giannis and Dame. I think that would be kind of your ideal resolution. And then with the Knicks, kind of just continue to hope and pray that, the starters don't run out of gas too early and, bolster up that bench. And then for the other teams, like you were talking about, the Lakers, they kind of got an early start, kind of getting rid of I'm not going to say dead weight, but just some of the obvious things that needed to change, maybe go out there, grab that center that you possibly could get to pair with AD, who knows? Clippers, like you talked about, hope that Kawhi comes back. And not just that he comes back, but that he comes back and he actually looks pretty good, which I think he will. Denver, I think you kind of want Jamal Murray to be better, but I think it might have to be time to move on from some guys like, Michael Porter Jr. I know that's been the rumor. So do you entertain that? Minnesota for sure would be, you kind of hope that your acquisitions play a little bit better, and not even just your acquisitions, but just guys in general on the squad. Like, do we get anything from McDaniels? Do we get anything from DiVincenzo? Does Naz Reid look okay? Does Mike Conley still have like one battery left? I don't know. Like, you kind of just are hoping that you can get over the edge a little bit and just be better and not be in the play-in. I think that should be their resolution. Don't be in the play-in, but who knows? They probably will end up there based on what we're seeing right now, because it's not like that these standings are finalized, but this is a general trajectory of where everyone's going to end up.
We're almost halfway through the season. Yeah. So obviously, like, if you look at the standings, like none of these teams are that far behind, right? Like the only team that in the West that's like starting to kind of separate itself is Oklahoma City in terms of the record, right? They're 25-5, right? The next team is Memphis, who's at 22-10, who may have possibly lost Ja for a little bit. We'll see.
Yeah.
If we get an update on that at some point. And that's like the Grizzlies' resolution, honestly, like for them is like, can you get healthy? Can you stay healthy, right? Like, can you put Ja somehow in a bubble wrap and make sure that, by the time you get to the playoffs, he's fine? Because I think regular season wise, seemingly they've got enough depth now where it's not that big of a deal. Although other guys on the periphery are starting to pick up injuries, like Marcus Smart has some injury with his finger, I think, so he's going to be out for a while. I think Santi Aldama has an ankle injury. He's week to week. And he was really good for them. Obviously, the other guys who had already been out continue to be out, like Vince Williams and GG Jackson. But yeah, for them, it's helped. Maybe like one more move as well. Like, could you possibly, like, if they had gotten Dorian Finney-Smith, that would have been pretty good, I think, because, you shore up, the other two guys in Conchar and Kennard and get like a more of a 3-and-D wing, which I
Yeah.
think probably they would like to have. But Dallas, please come back, Luka, at some point.
Yeah.
Because the problem for them is now he's going to be out for at least a month, and we know with these type of reports, it's not very common that these guys come back earlier than the initial timeline. So that's going to be a problem for them. They just lost to the Portland Trailblazers. Now, there was a little bit of context where they had some guys also miss the game because of suspensions, right? Like, you had a fight between Yusuf Nurkic and Najee Marshall. PJ Washington, I guess, gets into it. Marshall, I think, is out for 4 games. But just in general, yeah, you need Luka back. Because the problem is we already talked about that, if you start losing games, because they're not that far ahead of the teams behind them. Like, the Lakers and Clippers are a game and a half behind. And, obviously, like, those teams are dealing with injuries too, but like the Clippers are about to get Kawhi back, and the Lakers just made a trade to improve their team. So that's kind of a problem for a team like the Mavs. So we'll see. But just in terms of like, that grouping, like Dallas and Memphis, they're in like that tier of they're really, really good. Probably need Dallas, you just need to get healthy. I think Memphis, ideally, if you could make like one more move to get another veteran, then you're probably set because they're really good too. But OKC, obviously, for them, right, they need Chet back. So I think you're kind of hoping to get like a prolonged stretch where all their guys are healthy or as many of their guys are as healthy as possible because, they've had guys in and out of that lineup. And then, obviously in the East, you have Cleveland and Boston. So like Cleveland, Boston, OKC, those are right now seemingly your 3 best teams. Right, Boston, I think, still probably is the favorite. Although for them, I think their main thing is can they be healthy? Because they've had guys kind of in and out of the lineup, right? Like Drew Holiday's been in and out. Porzingis has been in and out. But that's kind of the last tier there, right? Where you have the Cavs also like for them. I think just can this work in the postseason? Because I think obviously now the thing is they're 27-4, right? So and I think this is another team where I think we're also going to have to take the L. Like we were over on the Cavs this season, but we did make a comment at the end of last season that we thought for them it was probably best to move on from Mitchell and just kind of build around the young guys. But it's a good thing they didn't listen to us because they've been very good this year. And with the way they've been playing, I'm not saying they're going to win the East, but they have a very good shot at making a deep playoff run. And they're certainly, I think a team that you have to take more seriously than before because of the fact that their young guys seemingly have gotten better. A guy like Garland now is back on track after having a rough season last year. Mobley looks better. He's even shooting threes now. We'll see if it looks good in the postseason. And they're getting contributions out of everybody. Like, I mean, they have the best record in the NBA. Over 30 games into the season, and they've only lost 4 games. That's a pretty historic pace, over the course of the season, right? You're almost through the halfway point, and you've not even lost, 6, 7 games. So, that last tier, those are the teams that I think, in terms of resolutions, theirs are a little bit different. Like, if you're the Celtics, you don't need to make a significant trade. You just got to stay healthy and continue to, play well, right? Like if you're, OKC, they might make a smaller move. Like maybe they get like a Cam Johnson or maybe they get some veteran guys or something like that. But the main thing for them is stay healthy. But, I think, for these resolutions, again, like you said, the standings aren't finalized because as we remember the last 2 seasons, every other day, right, we were doing stuff in terms of recording and talking about how this team looked like they were done, they were cooked, they were going to miss the playoffs.
Yeah.
And then like a week later they move like 3-4 spots up. So it's not finalized, but I think almost halfway through the season you're starting to get a more crystallized perception of how a lot of these teams across the league look. And I think as you kind of expect, there are teams that have been about as good as advertised, if not better. Teams that have been about what you expected, teams that have been a little worse, and then teams that have been way worse.
Yeah, I agree. I did want to go back to the Warriors.
Hmm.
I I want them to be aggressive and I want them to take risks. That would be my
Hmm.
resolution for them. Take risks. Because I think, I've seen enough with that team. I think you need to get Steph some more serious help. I don't think that roster is serious at all. But with the other tiers that you mentioned, I would say Cleveland, don't stray away from your game because they're playing really good team basketball. Everyone's
Yeah.
involved. Night in, night out, you're getting crazy performances from pretty much every single person who's on that team. Boston, I would say, don't listen to the outside noise. There's a lot of chatter, a lot of talk. I don't think they've ever been propped up like this, ever. Well, not as a franchise, but this core unit, I don't think they've been propped up this much. Where there's just been so much chatter, like they're the undisputed favorites and stuff like that. So I would say don't get complacent. Continue to play your game as well, kind of similar to Cleveland. And then OKC, that's a tough one because I think I've liked what I've seen from them.
Hmm.
But I think they can take strides elsewhere. Like, yes, they're winning games, but they haven't necessarily screamed like that they are ready for the championship yet. I don't think from what I've seen, but
Right.
I think there's still work to be done. So I would say
I need Jalen Williams to kind of, turn it
yes,
up a little.
yeah, that's been the disappointing part. I didn't really want to name a specific guy, but you know I think yeah he's the piece that will elevate their team offensively and defensively, honestly. So I think yeah you'd like to see a little bit more out of him, but overall, I mean you can't really hate on any of those resolutions because they're already great teams. Like all three of those teams are really good and they're in good spots. They're comfortable, but just don't get too comfortable.
Yeah, and the Cleveland one is fascinating because, I remember 2 seasons ago, right, when we were talking about the Nuggets, and we were like, that's kind of interesting how very few people are picking the Nuggets to represent the West,
Hmm.
even though they had, the 1 seed in the West for most of the season,
Hmm.
right? And they were far and away at one point ahead of everyone, until they had that latter part of the season where they just kind of took the nights off. Cleveland is in a spot that's even more wild because they're not just like number one in the East, they're number one in the league. And they have like, a historic winning percentage right now. And yet, nobody's really taking them seriously in regards to, like a legitimate championship level team. And I think part of that, again, is, when you have a series like they had 2 years ago against the Knicks, where I think they were favored to win that series, we picked them,
Yeah.
and then they disappoint in a big way. It kind of gives off like a lasting perception that unfortunately doesn't really get to get changed
Yeah.
until it turns around. And like they did win that first round matchup against the Magic last season, and they lost to the Celtics. They had a bunch of injuries, so that one couldn't really be helped. But for them, that's kind of the main thing. Like if you're a Cleveland fan, you're just unfortunately going to probably have to deal with the noise and the chatter until they actually do it. And that's just kind of how it is, unfortunately. Even though they are 27-4, because in general, like 27-4, you should automatically be talked about as like one of the favorites to win it all. Honestly, right? Like this isn't like a 60-win Hawks team where your best player, is like a guy who's like an all-star level guy, but not like an all NBA level guy, right? Like this
Sure.
is a scenario where you have a guy in Donovan Mitchell who's regarded as, at worst a top 15,
Yeah.
player.
There's crazy
And then
talent.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, and even after that, right? Like guys like Garland and Mobley and Allen and their bench, right? Like you got a really good squad. Now there's a couple of teams that I hadn't really mentioned because I have no idea what tier to realistically put them in.
Mhm.
Um and I feel well. I mean, really, to be fair, it's one team, and it's a team that's kind of been making a lot of noise as of late.
Mhm.
That's the Sacramento Kings.
Mhm.
I do not know what tier to put this team in. They have lost 6 in a row. They are 3-7 in their last 10. They have fired Mike Brown, right, the former coach of the year, just 1 year ago, one calendar year ago. They it was the first time they made the playoffs in nearly 20 years. They took the Warriors to 7 games when like nobody expected them to even have a chance to win the series at all. Everybody thought they were going to get rolled, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And they gave the Warriors, it took a 50-point Stephen Curry game 7, for them to pull out a win against the Kings. And they have gone backwards for 2 seasons in a row. Last season, we were not super high on them. As people who watch this podcast know, right? Like they missed the playoffs. Not really that much of a shocker. Although I think we thought maybe they might be able to sneak in the play, because we actually thought they would lose to Golden State in the play, and they did not. So they overcame that foe, but unfortunately, now the DeRozan signing is looking like a very bad signing, right? That it's not that he's playing poorly, but although he had some bad games, but the problem is, like in this last game that I watched against the Lakers, he was pretty good for most of the game, and it didn't matter, right? Like there was a stretch where he just couldn't miss, and then you blink and you look up and they're down 20, right, to a Laker team without LeBron and a bunch of other guys that weren't playing in the game. I mean, they got steamrolled, and this season they've lost the season series to the Lakers in a season sweep, right? Like whereas last season, like they rolled the Lakers in every matchup. They can't really defend that well. Some of the guys that I think you'd like to see maybe play more, it's kind of hard to play more because of the guys that they have in there, right? Like it's hard to play Keon Ellis, when you have a lot of guards on your team already. And, again, as I mentioned, they fired the coach, Mike Brown, before he even got on the plane ride, if I'm not mistaken, to one of those games. And it was kind of interesting how a lot of coaches around the league, spoke about the firing in a way where, they were not very, I mean, obviously nobody's going to be like, oh, yay, a guy got fired.
Right.
But like, other coaches have been fired, and you don't normally hear like as much noise in terms of, when in terms of like the coaches talking very supportively of that coach, and in like you had a couple of coaches that were like like Michael Malone just basically put a blowtorch to the Kings, right? He said no class and a few other things as well. Now he actually coached the Kings or at one point, right? He was there with DeMarcus Cousins, right? And they canned him as well. So for the Kings, nothing's going right. De'Aaron Fox might want out. Keegan Murray hasn't really been good. And then you just fired your coach and replaced him with Doug Christie. And in his first game, it didn't really fix anything at all. It looked pretty much the same. And in fact, at one stretch of the game, it was starting to look even worse. But just in general, it just seemingly just is it just sucks, right? For a team that 2 seasons ago seemed like, kind of like a lovable NBA team, right? That like a lot of people liked, a lot of people were rooting for. People thought they had a really fun style of play. And they were a playoff team, right? And then, the next season, it's mostly the same roster. Then they miss the playoffs, and then they make a big move this past offseason, and it hasn't helped at all. And I think you can now say that it made them worse. And it's funny because I went back to our old one, when we were looking at the Pacific Division, and we talked about the Kings, and their over-under was around 46.5. And we said under, but it was a slight under. And we actually kind of thought that, like, it might, like, that the Kings, it's a talent upgrade, but we were also kind of the mindset, like, the Western Conference may just be too good, for the Kings to still make the playoffs. But the main issue is the Kings themselves have been bad. And so, like, I don't really know where you really go from here, just because of the fact that, it felt like it was kind of weird, right? Because remember, in the offseason, it took a minute for Mike Brown to get his extension. He got an extension for 3 years, and then they canned him not even halfway into the season. So just kind of a weird situation from a organization that has a reputation for being very dysfunctional. It seemed like they had gotten out of it a couple seasons ago, and now, depending on what happens with this Fox situation, you might be right back where you started, where it's back to the NBA cellar for you guys.
Yeah, this is the Kings of old. This really was like a throwback. I understand why every single, coach that was kind of asked about it was very opinionated and came to Mike Brown's defense, because I think, this is the guy who literally ended the freaking playoff drought, number one. Number two, I think from what I've seen, there's been a lot of clips of him, kind of asking and pleading, maybe in probably an odd delivery way, but I think it was a good way, in terms of asking for accountability from a lot of the players. Because if you watch Kings basketball, what's been going viral has been the negative clips and negative plays at the end of games. That's the reason why they've been freaking losing. Like stupid fouls, stupid turnovers, lack of awareness, and it shows on all the players. No player is kind of like, walks away scot-free. Like, it could be any tier. It could be stars, De'Aaron
Yeah.
Fox. It could be, role players. And I think that's kind of where the accountability hunt may have gone not overboard, but I think it might have been a little bit too public. Maybe you do it behind closed doors, because he was going after the players in, like, the press conferences, which, like I said, I don't think that's a fireable offense. I think that's something that, the organization can talk through and work through. But yeah, to be fired over that is kind of crazy, because I don't think it just stems from, the mediocre and honestly god awful play in the fourth quarter. I don't think it stems from that, and it definitely doesn't stem from the poor record. Because if it was record based, then I think a lot of coaches would be out of the NBA right now. So I think it's an internal thing. I think it's an organizational thing, and I definitely think it was a player versus coach thing. But yeah, stupid, because I don't know what tier you put him in. I think you put him in like Control Alt Delete tier or something. I don't know. Like, this is stupid.
Yeah, I mean, and because in the final game before he got fired, right, he was talking about, well, at the end of the game, right, you had the scenario where Fox hits the mid-range pull-up jumper to put him up by 3.
Mm-hmm.
Then, they were supposed to foul, right, so that way the Pistons don't get off a 3. And not only do they not initially foul, they wait to foul until Jaden Ivey, right, does the sidestep dribble, pump fakes, gets off a shot, and then De'Aaron Fox, like, in midair, puts his hands right on Jaden Ivey.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, he contests it, but, like, in the worst possible way. He makes it, ties it up, hits the free throw, puts him up by 1, and all you have is, like, a 3/4 court heave, that has no, limited chance of going in.
Sure.
And like you said, they lose, right? And then, 3 of those losses recently came to the Lakers, which is a team that they didn't have issues with, prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
And, those were games that, they were kind of wire to wire victory, sort of. I know the Kings in a couple of these games closed the gap very quickly, and then right at the end, like in the other night, right, like this previous game, right, like they were down 20 in the fourth quarter after being up by 1 at halftime, and then they quickly closed the gap, and then they have like this horrible fourth quarter, like to close it out, where they have like 2-3 possessions where a guy just throws the ball out of bounds, like at the top of the key, and it's like, I don't even know what's going on there. So, I mean, again, as we talked about, like, the problems were not just the coaching. Like, maybe you could say that like you said, that you didn't like maybe some of the things that he was doing this season. But in the NBA, the problems extend beyond just the coaching when you have a situation like that. It's also the roster. And I think it's pretty clear through the first, 32 games of the season for them that the roster doesn't work. You don't have enough guys. You got too many guys that do kind of the same thing, but not at an elite enough level, I guess, to really be able to win a high percentage of games, because like you said, they have not been able to close games despite having multiple guys, right, that have reputations for being, late game bucket getters, right, and just hasn't worked for them.
Yep.
And because they can't get stops, right? Like, I mean, they've been lit up in some, and not all these games have been super high scoring. But, for them, their offense needs to be elite in order for them to win. And that's just not really a position you really want to be in, if you're one of these teams that needs to win games. Because, I mean, NBA teams are too good in terms of, like, if they kind of figure out how to score on you and you don't really have an answer for it, you're kind of really in a tough spot. And with the way the roster is constructed, I don't think there's a quick, easy fix. Like, I think you're probably kind of in the spot where you might just be kind of stuck. And, again, like, the DeRozan contract isn't long, but it's not a 1-year deal. So, and I don't think you're trading him because you just signed him. And I think, like, how many teams are realistically going to want him at this point, even though he can still play. But yeah, it's not a good spot. I mean, does Devin Carter come back and save it? Like, probably not. But, maybe he's a guy that could help. But just in general, yeah. Like, and it's tough because, again, they're 6 games below 500. Every team above them is, like the Suns are the worst one game below 500, right? Whereas the Kings now, like, just to get to 500, you got to win 6 in a row. And by the time you get to that point, you're halfway through the season. And if you're halfway through the season and you're still like 11, 12 or whatever, I mean, not that you're completely cooked, but that's just not where you want to be if you're the Kings. If you're the Kings, or any of these teams, you want to be able to avoid the play-in if you can, just so that way you have, a much better shot at actually making the playoffs, which is if you're the Kings, that's what you want to do. Like if you're the Kings, I don't think they envision themselves as cheering over being the 12th seed in the Western Conference. So,
Yeah,
that's the tough part.
it's crazy. And
Yeah.
we didn't even like address like the Fox News and the rumors on that. Like,
Yeah.
now you're about to lose Fox potentially.
Right. Yeah. Depending on how that situation goes,
Yeah.
as well. Just kind of like just to kind of touch up on a couple of these Western teams. So, because we kind of mentioned Denver, we mentioned Clippers, we mentioned a lot of those teams. The Suns we didn't talk about as much. What do you do with them there, right? Because they're 3-7 in their last 10 games. They just lost the game against the Mavs without Luka. And then they just lost to the Warriors, right, who hadn't been playing very well either after, having a lead for most of that game or different points in the game. Obviously Booker's been out. I looked through the first 30 games of last season. Durant, Booker, and Beal. Durant has missed like a few more games, but not that much more from the first 30 games of last season. But Booker and Beal have actually missed a little bit less. So I guess technically you've been a little healthier than you were last season, aside from Durant missing a few more games. But it's basically about the same result. So what do you do here with the Phoenix Suns? Because they got off to a great start at the, kind of like Golden State, they got off to a great start at the beginning of the season. Although I think we felt that regular season wise, the Suns would be better off than Golden State. But again, we're 30 games into the season and they're still in the plan. I mean, currently they're 11th, which is out of the plan, but all these records are so close they could easily be in there again in a few games.
Yeah, it's tough. I think this is one of the harder solutions just because their hands are pretty much tied. I think the one to watch and the guy to watch is probably Beal because, you get nights where he plays against the Warriors and he has like, a solid 28 points and is doing, has an all around game. But then against the Mavericks, which I think is a more realistic version of the team as a whole, is what you're going to get 5 for 18, 11 points, just not doing enough on either end of the floor. Or we already know he's not really that good of a defender, so we can cross that off. So you got to be on point offensively, and I think they just don't really have, a unit that really is cohesive. I've been thoroughly disappointed with a lot of the play that I've seen from a lot of the starters, and I think when Booker's out, that definitely hurts. So it would kind of be a similar tier to Philly, but like you said, the health hasn't been a super crazy factor to the point where, where they are like in the same boat as Philly, but it's a similar situation where I guess, you just want to see the big three play together.
Yeah.
You want to see them play together. And we haven't really seen a whole lot of games like that.
Yeah. And like last season, they turned it on, but then it still kind of ended in, kind of like a rough situation. So it may just kind of just be that they may just kind of be mired in like this weird spot where like, again, they may not be able to kind of, climb out of that, 6, spot, and they may just kind of be stuck there. And it just becomes so much harder to be able to, win from there. But, again, personnel wise, we'll see what kind of goes on there. But just in terms of these resolutions, right? Like, now we're past the 30 game mark for a lot of these teams. And, some teams have, still have a lot of questions left, right? And that's kind of what happens when you're at this point of the NBA season. But, just let us know your thoughts, on the New Year's resolutions for a lot of these teams. As for, any more NBA rumors, not really a whole lot, that's kind of been going on. I mean, obviously, you still continue to have like the Jimmy Butler situation, the De'Aaron Fox situation. ESPN has continued to report that the Rockets, seemingly according to insiders, they're the runaway pick as the team to watch for the star. Like it feels like that's probably, if De'Aaron Fox gets moved, that's probably, where he goes. I guess the question would be like, what's the package, right? Like, are, any of the, good young players in the deal, do they add in like some of the veteran expiring guys like a Jeff Green, and others? How many picks do they add? But that's, if I'm Houston, and I think that's closer to the right move because we talked about it, where you shouldn't go after a guy like a Jimmy Butler if you're Houston, because that's an older star that might be on the downside of his career. But if you go after De'Aaron Fox, that's a guy that's basically in his prime, and position wise And, star power wise, like that's the caliber of a guy that if you can get him, that's the guy you should want. Now, is Sacramento actually going to trade him? Should they even trade him at all? That's another question. But like if you're Houston, that's the guy that you have to go after.
Yeah, it makes 100% sense. Like you said, I think he's probably going to be one of the more, if not the most sought out, disgruntled star or allegedly disgruntled star.
Right.
Because I
Came out of
really,
nowhere.
yeah, it was weird, but I mean, truthfully, if they're playing this bad, then I would argue he probably doesn't want to be there anymore. That's kind of just what I would take. And then also like him having the conversation with Mike Brown, lengthy conversation, and then 2 hours later he's fired. I mean, I don't know. Like maybe they're trying to appease him. I don't know. You never want to speculate, but it is a weird situation. But like you said, Houston would definitely be the destination. I would love that.
Yeah, not to mention like after, they asked him about it and he basically was like along the lines of like, well, he got paid, so it's
Yeah.
kind of like, it's like he was almost kind of like, whatever.
Well, yeah, I don't care.
Yeah, but yeah, basically, which is, you don't usually see that.
Nope.
According to ESPN also, NBA teams want format change. So there's several teams that are pushing for the idea of the 1-16 playoff bracket as opposed to, the East West, because everybody's talked about it like, the discrepancy between, the Eastern and the Western conferences in terms of like, the bottom of the East not really being that great, and the West having like so many playoff caliber teams, right? So again, like this would be something that would be a major shakeup. There are other leagues that do this, right? Obviously in the NBA, this is what they do. But I still don't really think that it's probably going to happen because they did mention that, half of the, a decent amount of teams would have to agree to it. And said such a revision would require half of the East to vote in favor, with many middling teams voting against their best interest, right? Because, like, say if you're a team like Detroit and it's 1-16, right? Then it would be a little bit tougher, right? Because they wouldn't be, they wouldn't be 10 with the ability to be in the play-in, right? They'd be a little bit lower. Even like a Philly, right? Like they'd be kind of close to being pretty much just done. Right? Because there'd be several teams ahead of them. So for a lot of these teams, there isn't as, so for the teams in the middle, there isn't as much incentive because if it's 1-16, they can't get in. But what do you think of like, let's say you didn't have to do that. Like, let's say you could just snap your fingers and either it could be 1-16 or East-West. Would you go for this?
Oh, I'm changing it to 1-16 instantly. I personally hate the fact that it's East and West. I know that might be kind of, a hot take, but I'm more of like the football mindset where, it should be division leaders and, your wild card or whatever playing something along those lines. Like there shouldn't really be like, okay, yeah, eight teams, from the East, 8 teams from the West. Like, I think it doesn't matter. The best team should get in my opinion. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. And I think you could also add even some more intrigue into the regular season where, if it was 1-16, again, some of these teams wouldn't be able to kind of cruise. Like they would have to kind of kick it in the higher gear if they want to get in.
Yeah.
Because, instead of it being 1-10 in each conference, right? You might be in a little bit of a different spot, right? Because say again, like if you look at the NBA standings, right? The 10 seed in the West is Golden State, who's 16 and 15. The 10 seed in the East are the Detroit Pistons, who are 14 and 18.
Yep.
Right. So that's a lot different in terms of, comparing, if you just did it overall, right? As opposed to, what you would normally do in terms of like, 1-30 or whatever. Right. So it would look a lot different. And I think that's a way that you could get, things a little bit more interesting. I just don't necessarily know if they're actually going to do it. And I think that's kind of the problem that you have there where, again, it already kind of mentioned it right there, where it's like there are some teams that they would be voting against their own best interest if they did that. So it's probably going to stay, the way that it is in terms of East and West. But it would be an interesting experiment, I think, for sure.
And they need to find a way to make divisional games matter. I guarantee you that would help the regular season a little bit.
Right. Because, I guess where they can matter is you have the tiebreakers, right? So presumably, like say if you had like Lakers Kings down the wire, like the Lakers have the tiebreaker.
Mhm.
So, they would leapfrog them if they had the same record. I guess if you're kind of looking at, some of these other teams, right, that have like Golden State, I think has the tiebreaker against Houston. So let's say they somehow had the same record, like they would leapfrog Houston, things like that. And, so those in type, and that's why like a game like Lakers Warriors, the stakes are also kind of high
Yes.
because that's a divisional matchup where
Mhm.
because the Lakers got that win, right? That allows you to kind of have, a little bit of, you know, a buoy, right? For now. Obviously, they will play them 3 more times, so the tiebreaker could change because that's what happened last season, right? Where
Mhm.
the Lakers won the first matchup against Golden State, and then the next 3 matchups, right, like they lost,
Yeah.
mostly because either no LeBron or no AD in each of those matchups. But, just in general, like, yeah, but and that's where like you kind of wonder could the NBA Cup do anything about that, right? Because you got to have a reward, I think, for the NBA Cup winner, beyond just the money, right?
Yes.
Because the last game, that last game doesn't count, right? Like say, for the Bucks, it's not an extra, and then like part of it's because then they'd have 83 games, but there would need to be like I think another incentive, there too, right? Beyond just because the money's obviously great, like
Mhm.
nobody's saying like get rid of the money reward,
Mhm.
but there's got to be an additional reward there too. Just again, ways to kind of be able to add drama to the regular season without them shortening the schedule because we know they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on the trade with Dorian Finney-Smith, D'Angelo Russell, Shake Milton, and Maxwell Lewis. Let us know your thoughts on the New Year's resolutions for all of these teams in terms of where you think some of these teams currently stand in the NBA and what they might need to do. Because again, we're almost at the end of 2024, going into 2025, so we're getting closer to the halfway point of the NBA season. The trade deadline will be coming up, in February. So obviously we'll have to, talk about that when that comes in. Maybe teams will make trades before that. And just in general, continue to like and support the channel. If you comment, we will read your comment at the beginning of the video. Obviously, if you subscribe, that helps grow the channel as well. And we'll see you in the next episode.